So today we're going to be discussing Chapter 4 of our textbook, Crime and Social Control. The learning objectives for this week are as follows. We're going to list patterns of crime and criminals that are consistent across global regions. We're going to argue which of the various methods of measuring crime is the most accurate. We're going to identify the crime prevention implications of each sociological theory of crime. We're going to differentiate between and give examples of each of the types of crimes discussed. We're going to use each of the demographic variables discussed, explain their relationship to the likelihood of criminal behavior and victimization. We're going to assess the relative consequences to society of crimes in the streets and crime in the suites, meaning offices. And we're going to analyze the various social forces that lead to and away from the punitive criminal justice policies of previous decades. The chapter outline is as follows. We're going to first discuss the global context, international crime and social control. Then we're going to move on to sources of crime statistics. Then we're going to discuss sociological theories of crime, followed by types of crime, and followed by demographic patterns of crime. And then we're going to continue to talk on the societal consequences of crime and social control. We're going to move to strategies for action of crime and social control. And then we're going to try to understand crime and social control. So the global context, international crime and social control. Several facts about crime throughout the world. There is no country without crime. Most countries have the same components in their criminal justice system, police, courts, and prisons. Adult males make up the largest category of crime suspects. And in all countries, theft is the most common crime committed and violent crime is a relatively rare event. Continue on the global context. In 2014, there were over 200,000 homicides globally. 25% are estimated to have occurred in North America. Crime rates, the number of particular crimes per 100,000 people in a population, take into consideration differences in population size and are more accurate. So countries with higher inequality tend to have higher homicide rates, while more egalitarian countries have lower homicide rates. So transnational crimes, as defined by the U.S. Department of Justice, transnational crimes is organized criminal activity across one or more national borders. So this is a young boy, a victim of human trafficking, is forced to work in a balloon factory outside of Dhaka, Bangladesh. Human trafficking is estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise approaching the international value of drug and arms trafficking according to Interpol. So the sources of crime statistics. So what is crime? Crime is a violation of federal, state, and local criminal law. And there are three major types of statistics used to measure crime. And they are official statistics, victimization surveys, and self-report offender surveys. So the Uniform Crime Report, annually compiled by the FBI, which these are official statistics, states that crime rate is the number of crimes committed per 100,000 of the population, and clearance rate is the percentage of crimes in which an arrest and official charge have been made and the case has been turned over to the courts. Official statistics have several shortcomings. Many crimes are not reported, some reported crimes are not recorded by police, and some rates may be exaggerated. As far as victimization servicing, acknowledging the tendency for so many crimes to go unreported and thus undetected by the UCR, the U.S. Department of Justice conducts a National Crime Victimization Survey, known as the NCVS. Interviewers collect a variety of information, including the victim's background, for example, their age, race, ethnicity, sex, marital status, education, and their relationship to the offender, whether it's stranger or non-stranger, and the extent to which the victim was harmed. Now, self-report offender surveys ask offenders about their criminal behavior. Self-reported data compensate for many of the problems associated with the official statistics, but are still subject to exaggerations and concealment. Self-report surveys reveal that virtually every adult has engaged in some type of criminal activity. For individuals to be officially labeled criminals, their behavior must become known to have occurred. The behavior must come to the attention of the police, who then file a report, conduct an investigation, and make an arrest. And finally, the arrestee must go through the preliminary hearing on arraignment and the trial and may or may not be convicted. So this is basically the steps for individuals to be officially labeled criminals. If someone doesn't know that you committed a crime, then you're not going to be labeled a criminal. So once you go through these three processes is when an individual will be officially labeled a criminal. So onto the sociological theories of crime. And first we're going to discuss the structural functionalist perspective. According to Durkheim and other functionalists, crime can have the following functions for society. It can strengthen group cohesion and it could lead to social change. Structural functionalist is a perspective and not a theory of crime. There are three functionalist theories of crime. First are Merton's strain theory, then there's a subcultural theories, and then there's control theory. So remember that the structural functionalist is a perspective, and under that perspective are various theories of crime that work under the structural functionalist perspective. And these three are just an example. So Merton's strain theory. He states that people adapt to inconsistency between means and goals in society. This inconsistency leaves people strained. So they have a method of adaptation which is conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. So for example, conformity would be somebody who just conforms to society and just wakes up every morning, goes to work, does what they have to do, and they've conformed. Innovation could be someone who uses different ideas to acquire success. For example, one can say that drug dealers are a form of innovators because they're using the sale of drugs to have success. And Merton may say that the strain theory, he states that there's an inconsistency between the means and goals. And in society, the goals that we want to acquire, the American dreams, you hear that every day. So these methods of adaptation give insight as to ways in which people succeed in reaching the goals that American dream that society says that we all have a chance of attaining. So, some people rebel, some people retreat and just don't even be part of society. And like I said, conformity are those people that just conform to the idea and just try their best. And innovation, one example would be drug dealers. So subcultural theories. Certain groups or subcultures in society have values and attitudes conducive to violence. Members of these subcultures adopt the crime-promoting attitudes of the group. This one's kind of self-explanatory. And then there's the control theory by Hershey, 1969. Social bonds constrain some individuals from violating social norms. So attachment to significant others, commitment to conventional goals, involvement in conventional activities, and belief in the moral standards of society. So when someone says something like, well, so-and-so was able to succeed and he didn't have to become a drug dealer or didn't have to start a life of crime, if you will, so they can achieve the American dream. So if so-and-so can do it, why are people now committing crime to achieve that American dream? Well, the control theory would state that the reason why this person maybe did not become a criminal to achieve, quote-unquote, the American dream would be because they have attachment to significant others that may look down upon them if they do start a life of crime. They have a commitment to conventional goals, they have an involvement in conventional activities, and they have a belief in the moral standards of society. So now on to the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective states that social inequality leads to crimes as means of economic survival. Those in power define what is criminal, and law enforcement penalizes those without power and benefits those with power. So to a Marxist, the cultural definition of women as property contributes to the high rates of female criminality and specifically involvement in prostitution, drug abuse, and petty theft. Under a plan called Coalition Project 2012, prostitutes can no longer advertise by standing or sitting in residential windows or storefronts, and now use art objects as symbolic representation. So this would be the Marxist argument as to why some women may contribute in the high rates of female criminality. Now, onto the symbolic interaction perspective, and a theory that falls under the symbolic interaction perspective is the labeling theory. And it states that being labeled deviant leads to further deviant behavior. The labeled person is denied opportunities to engage in non-deviant behavior, and the labeled person adopts a deviant self-concept and acts accordingly. So, for example, somebody who maybe was arrested and was put in prison and gets out and they have fulfilled their punishment, and now they want to start becoming a productive member of society, but now they have the label of ex-con, and it's hard for them to get a job. So this labeled person is denied opportunities to engage in non-deviant behavior, and the labeled person then adopts a deviant self-concept and acts accordingly. So then when you hear about people reoffending and going back to prison, the labeling theory would offer some insight as to why such things happen. The symbolic interactions perspective also talks about the primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is deviant behavior committed before a person is caught and labeled an offender. Secondary deviance is deviance that results from being caught and labeled. So primary deviance is somebody who may be deviant from the norm, but it hasn't been caught, so they're not labeled an offender. Or rather, they may be labeled an offender, but it's not something that's socially known because they weren't caught. And secondary deviance is deviance that results from being caught and labeled. So that is somebody who's committed a crime or is deviant from the social norms and is caught, and then they're labeled. So being labeled as deviant often leads to further deviant behavior because the person who is labeled as deviant is often denied opportunities for engaging in non-deviant behavior, and labeled persons internalize the deviant label and adopt a deviant self-concept and act accordingly. So now we're going to move on and discuss the types of crimes. There are index offenses that deal with violent crime and property crime. There's vice crime, there's organized crime, there's white-collar crime, computer crime, and juvenile delinquency. So concerning index offenses, the FBI identifies 8 index offenses as the most serious crimes in the United States. The index offenses, or street crimes as they are often called, can be against a person, called violent or personal crimes, or against property. Other types of crime include vice crime, such as drug use, gambling, and prostitution, organized crime, white-collar crime, computer crime, and juvenile delinquency. Hate crimes are discussed in Chapter 9. So some examples of street crimes, violent offenses. So violent crimes include homicide, assault, rape, and robbery. And homicide refers to the willful or non-negligent killing of one human being by another individual or group of individuals. And although homicide is the most serious of the violent crimes, it is also the least common, accounting for only 1.2% of all violent crimes. Mass murders are also violent crimes, and they have more than one victim in a killing event. Unlike mass murder, serial murder is an unlawful killing of 2 or more victims by the same offenders in separate events. So serial murder is also a violent crime. And another form of violent crime is aggravated assault, and involves attacking a person and the intent to cause serious bodily injury. Another violent crime is acquaintance rape and is committed by someone known to the victim. As much as 80% of all rapes are committed by someone the victim knows. And although acquaintance rapes are the most likely to occur, they are the least likely to be reported and the most difficult to prosecute. And classic rape, another form of violent crime, is committed by a stranger with the use of a weapon resulting in serious bodily injury to the victim. The rapist was a stranger who used a weapon, and the attack resulted in serious bodily injury. Women hesitate to report the crime out of fear of not being believed, and the increased use of rape drugs such as Rohypnol may lower reporting levels even further. Robbery is another form of violent crime. It's unlike simple theft. It also, because it involves force or the threat of force or putting a victim in fear, and is thus considered a violent crime. Officially in 2015, more than 327,000 robberies took place in the United States. Robberies are most often committed using strong armed tactics and occurred disproportionately in southern states. So now on to street crime, which are property offenses. Property crime or street crimes, speaking specifically about property offenses. So property crimes are those in which someone's property is damaged, destroyed, or stolen. They include larceny, motor vehicle theft, burglary, and arson. The number of property crimes has declined 14.4% since 2011, with a 4.3% decrease between 2014 and 2015. So other forms of property crime are larceny, burglary, and arson. Larceny or simple theft accounts for more than 2/3 of all property arrests and is the most common index offense. Burglary, which is the second most common index offense after larceny, entails entering a structure, usually a house, with the intent to commit a crime while inside. And arson involves the malicious burning of a property of another. So now on to vice crimes. Vice crimes, often thought of as common as crimes against morality, are illegal activities that have no complaining participants and are often called victimless crimes. Examples of vice crimes include the use of illegal drugs, engaging in or soliciting prostitution, illegal gambling, or pornography. Most Americans view drug use as socially disruptive. There is less consensus, however, nationally or internationally, that gambling or prostitution are problematic. In the United States, prostitution is illegal with the exception of several counties in Nevada. Gambling is legal in many U.S. states, including casinos in Nevada, New Jersey, Connecticut, North Carolina, and other states, as well as state lotteries, bingo parlors, and horse and dog racing. And pornography, particularly internet porn, is a growing international problem. Regulation is made difficult by fears of government censorship and legal wrangling as to what constitutes obscenity. So this is all still talking about vice crime. And organized crime, which is criminal activity conducted by members of a hierarchically arranged structure devoted primarily to making money through illegal means. So now on to white-collar crime. White-collar crimes are those committed in a course of employment or by corporations in the interest of maximizing profit. Occupational are individual crimes, individuals who commit crimes in the course of their employment. And corporate crime are corporations who violate law to maximize profit. And these are all forms of white-collar crime. So here's an example of white-collar crime. Air Force Lieutenant Stephanie Erdman's eye was injured by sharp metal when the airbag of her 2002 Civic exploded. And Lieutenant Erdman testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on the defective Takata airbags and the need for vehicle recalls. So this is a form of corporations, specifically Honda, who made a car with a defective airbag. And it's considered a crime if they did it purposely. Another form of white-collar crime is insider trading and corporate violence. Insider trading is the use of privileged, i.e. non-public information by an employee of an organization that it gives the employee an unfair advantage in buying, selling, and trading stocks or other securities. One example of this is Martha Stewart, right? That's her name. She was in prison for, I believe, 2 or 3 years for insider trading, where she sold and got rid of stock that she knew that were going to go down. And corporate violence is the production of unsafe products and the failure of corporations to provide a safe working environment for their employees. So again, that Honda example that we just went is an example of corporate violence as well. So onto computer crime. Computer crime is any law violation in which a computer is the target of means of criminal activity. It's one of the fastest growing crimes in the US. Hacking is an unauthorized computer intrusion, and identity theft is stealing of someone else's identification to obtain credit. So, juvenile delinquency and gangs. In general, children younger than age 18 are handled by the juvenile courts, either as status offenders or as delinquent offenders. A status offense is a violation that can be committed only by a juvenile, such as running away from home, truancy, which is skipping school, and underage drinking. A delinquent offense is an offense that would be a crime if committed by an adult, such as any of the 8 index offenses. The most common status offense handled in juvenile courts are underage drinking, truancy, and running away. In 2015, 8.5% of all arrests, including traffic violations, were of offenders younger than the age of 18. So now on to demographic patterns of crime. Although virtually everyone violates a law at some time, individuals with certain demographic characteristics are disproportionately represented in crime statistics. Victims, for example, are disproportionately young, lower class, minority males from urban areas. And similarly, the probability of being an offender varies by gender, age, race, social class, and region. So here's a graph of the demographic patterns of crime. So you can see here, so for example, we're just going to go over a couple. So larceny, for males and females, more males commit larceny than females. Then here's the age, under 25 and over 25. So 39% are under 25, 60% are over 25. And as far as the race, white would be 27%, black would be 69%. So let's look at prostitution and commercial vice. So here we see that 36% are males, 64% are females, 68% are over 25, 31% are under 25, and 39% are white, and 54.5% are black. So I just want to make a point that when we look at these statistics and these numbers, we must always talk about the injustices that are going on within the institutions, such as the criminal justice system and the police. And we see it now. That's why people are protesting, is that the racism is running rampant. So whenever we discuss percentages, we must also discuss how racism plays a part in all of this. So demographic patterns of crime, gender, and crime. It is a universal truth that women everywhere are less likely to commit crime than men. That is a fact, and you cannot argue with that. It's just the way it is. In 2015, males accounted for 73.1% of all arrests, 79.7% of all arrests are violent crime, and 61.7% of all arrests are property crimes. A feminist criminology would focus on how the subordinate position of women in society affects their criminal behavior and victimization. So feminist falls under the conflict theory perspective, and here they'll look at the power structures between men and women. So speaking of age and crime, in general, criminal activity is more prevalent among younger people than among older people. In 2015, 34.2% of all arrests in the United States were of people younger than the age of 25. So now speaking about race, social class, and crime, race is a factor in who gets arrested. Minorities are disproportionately represented in official statistics. When we say disproportionately represented, it means that there's higher percentage of minorities in the official statistics than there are actually minorities in our society. So for example, when you see something like there's 13 or 14% of the society is made up by Black or African Americans. But then we look at numbers of arrest records, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it that 40% for such and such crime are blacks when there's only 13% or 13 or 14% of blacks in our society? So that goes back to the question of what is in play in our social institutions that is causing this. Because remember, this is a sociology class, so we look at the social institutions. And then we must discuss, like I said earlier, how racism is running rampant in our social institutions. So, for example, African Americans represent about 14% of the population, but account for 36.4% of all arrests for violent index offenses and 27.8% of all arrests for property index offenses. So that's just exactly what I just said. So here, Black Lives Matter grew out of protest against the shooting of an unarmed black man by the police and the subsequent lack of accountability. The BLM movement has broadened its approach to include fighting against all state violence directed towards African Americans. In 2017, BLM initiated an I'm unsafe option in Facebook to symbolize the sense of fear felt by blacks in America. And as many of you are aware, Black Lives Matter is right now in the forefront of discourse. We're seeing it on the news, we're seeing it on social media, with what happened with George Floyd, and the protests that we're seeing in the streets. And right now I know that Black Lives Matter, their next step is trying to demilitarize the police. They're using the hashtag defund the police, which basically means to stop, it's asking cities not to give so much money to police stations out of their budget, and that we should be giving them to the social institutions that are helping society, such as things that are helping the poor, things that are helping education. So I'm sure that you guys have seen that also as well on social media, as like I said, Black Lives Matter is a big topic right now. So here are some examples of what happens with crimes and race. There's a thing called racial profiling, and it's the practice of targeting suspects on the basis of their race. It may be responsible for their higher arrest rates. Proponents of the practice argue that because race, like gender, is a significant predictor of who commits crime, the practice should be allowed. Opponents hold that racial profiling is little more than discrimination and should therefore be abolished. So crime rates are higher. Now we're talking about region and crime. Crime rates are higher in the metropolitan areas than in non-metropolitan areas. In 2015, the violent crime rate in metropolitan statistical areas was 401.9% for every 100,000 people in the population. In cities in non-metropolitan statistical areas, it was 384.4 per 100,000 in the population. So that number, again, I'm sorry, is not percentage. It is out of the 100,000 people, each 100,000 people in the population, 401.9 people in metropolitan statistical areas was the violent crime rate. In non-metropolitan areas, for every 100,000 people, 388.4 people were part of some sort of violent crime. So the National Crime Victimization Survey indicates no statistical difference in violent crimes between 2014 and 2015. Violent crime has decreased significantly over the last 20 years. Victims who knew their offenders were more likely to classify them as friends or acquaintances, and the results are in part a function of the tendency for females to be much more likely to report victimization by an intimate partner than males. So on to the cost of crime and social control. So the physical injury and the loss of life. Crime often results in physical injury and loss of life. Moreover, the U.S. Public Health Service now defines violence as one of the top health concerns facing Americans. So that's just one of the costs of crime and social control. One cost is physical injury and the loss of life. Another cost is the high price of crime. Coughlin in 2007 suggested that the financial cost of crime can be classified into at least 6 categories. Direct loss from crime, such as the destruction of buildings through arson, of private property through vandalism, and of the environment by polluters, the costs associated with transferring of property, and the costs associated with criminal violence, for example, the medical costs of treating crime victims. So this is actually looking at the cost, the actual cost, the price, what it's costing us. So costs associated with the production and sale of illegal goods and services, the cost of prevention and protection, the billions of dollars spent on locks and safes, and the cost of social control, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, litigative and judicial activities, corrections, and victims assistance. So again, this is just looking at the price, the actual price that it's costing us. So now on to the cost of crime and social control, but specifically social and psychological costs. So crime entails social and psychological costs as well as economic costs. One such cost is fear, is independent upon individual perceptions of crime as a problem. For example, surveys since 2001 indicate that Americans' fear of victimization has increased even as violent and property crimes have decreased. So some strategies for action and local initiatives. Technology and crime. Hard technologies include metal detectors, home security systems, etc. And soft technologies include crime analysis programs like Amber Alerts, etc. So programs are Predpool, Spot Shotter System, Facebook, and GPS. So there's also youth programs that have early intervention programs that acknowledge that preventing crime is better than curing it once it has occurred. And community programs, neighborhood watch programs involve local residents in crime prevention strategies. So back to Black Lives Matter and defunding the police. This is where Black Lives Matter would say money needs to go to. Instead of spending millions and millions of dollars in militarizing the police, we should demilitarize the police and start giving money to youth programs and community programs. So these are different policies that are strategies for action. So the criminal justice system is based on the principle of deterrence, the use of harm or the threat of harm to prevent unwanted behaviors. And the criminal justice system assumes that people rationally choose to commit crimes, weighing their rewards and consequences for their actions. Thus, get tough measures hold that maximizing punishment will increase deterrence and cause crime rates to go down. If deterrence was working, you would see no murders. If deterrence was working, you would see people not really commit crimes because we see the punishment. We see the punishment. We know that people who commit murder could possibly get the death penalty, but people are still committing murders. So is deterrence really working? So law enforcement agencies in 2013, the United States had 1 million full-time law enforcement officers and full-time civilian employees. For example, there were clerks, meter attendants, correctional guards, yielding an estimated of 3.3 law enforcement personnel per 1,000 people inhabitants. There are over 14,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. So again, this is just giving you the strategies that society has created to stop crime, and law enforcement agencies is one of the strategies. So rehabilitation versus incapacitation. An important debate concerns the primary purpose of the criminal justice system. Is it to rehabilitate offenders or to incapacitate them through incarceration? Both rehabilitation and incapacitation are concerned with recidivism rates, or the extent to which criminals commit another crime. Rehabilitation believes in helping offenders rehabilitate using education and job training, individual to group therapists, substance abuse counseling, and behavior modification. And incapacitation is basically putting offender in prison. Opponents of incapacitation would say that rehabilitation is the better option because when we educate prisoners and we put them through group therapies and we offer behavior modification, most people believe that would reduce the recidivism rate. And the recidivism rate are people that commit crimes, go to prison, leave prison, continue to commit crimes, and go back to prison. And people against incapacitation would also state that the fact that we're putting offenders in prison and not dealing with the issue, not educating, that is going to increase the recidivism rate. So fear of crime has led to a public emphasis on incapacitation and a demand for tougher mandatory sentences and a reduction in the use of probation and parole, and support the three strikes you're out policy and truth in sentencing laws. However, these tough measures have recently come under attack for three reasons. First, research indicates that incarceration may not deter crime, like I said earlier. Second is the accusation that get tough measures such as California's three strikes and you're out policy are not equally applied. Again, that's looking at the disproportional rates in minorities. And finally, in an environment of budget deficits and legislative cuts, states simply can no longer afford the policies of a decade ago. So again, this three strikes and you're out policy is controversial only because, again, we're incapacitating these people in prison and we're not rehabilitating them. So recidivism rates are going to go higher when we act this way. So now we're telling them that if you come back in for 3 times and you're caught, that's it, you're out and you got to spend the rest of your life in prison, which is unfair. Because again, we're not addressing the root of the issue. We're not rehabilitating these people. So another strategy is the corrections. An examination of global rates reveals that the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. For every 100,000 people in the population of the United States, 666 people are in prison. The U.S. rate exceeds many times over those of other countries. So, for example, the rate in Russia is 436 per 100,000 people. Iraq is 123 per 100,000 people. Mexico is 192 per 100,000 people. And China is 118 per 100,000 people. And the rate for England and Wales is 145 per 100,000 people. And Canada is 114 per 100,000 people. And Germany is 76 per 100,000 people. So it is a fact that in the United States, there are more people in prison than in any other country. While there was a notable increase in the U.S. prison population between 2012 and 2013, in general, the prison population has declined since 2005 after decades-long increases. We're going to discuss more about this when we talk about race and immigration, and we're going to watch the documentary 13th on Netflix, and that's going to talk about basically how mass incarceration has played a big problem in the United States. So another form of strategy is probation and parole. Probation is the conditional release of an offender who, for a specific time period and subject to certain conditions, remains under court supervision in the community. And parole entails release from prison for a specific time period and subject to certain conditions before the inmate's sentence is finished. And finally, capital punishment. With capital punishment, the state takes the life of a person as punishment for a crime. In 2015, 25 countries carried out 1,634 executions, excluding the thousands who are thought to have been executed in China. The United States is the only Western industrialized nation in the world to retain the death penalty. In 2016, 20 inmates were executed in the United States. Of the 31 states that have the death penalty, the majority and the federal government almost exclusively use lethal injection as the method of execution. So now this is legislative action. So one form of legislative action is gun control. In 2015, firearms were used in 71.5% of the nation's murders, 40.8% of robberies, and 24.2% of aggravated assaults. Those against gun control argue that not only do citizens have a constitutional right to own guns, but also that more guns may actually lead to less crimes, as would-be offenders retreat in self-defense when confronted. So I don't like the term gun control just because people think that we're trying to control their rights to bear arms, and I would rather prefer say gun reform, because there are certain type of weapons out in society that are militarized weapons, and we do need some sort of reform when we look at these statistics. So other forms of major legislative initiatives have been passed in recent years, including the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which created community policing, the Three Strikes You're Out, and truth in sentencing laws. Other significant crime-related legislation is the Medicare Fraud Enforcement and Prevention Act, Preventing Gun Violence Act, Safety from Sex Offenders Act, Nichols Law, and Child Gun Safety and Gun Access Prevention Act. So, understanding crime and social control. Research supports both structural functionalists and conflict theorists. National Crime Justice Commission Act of 2015, if passed, would establish a commission to review the criminal justice system and make recommendations. Movement toward restorative justice and repairing the victim-offender community relationship. So this is just basically saying that research is supporting the structural functionalist and the conflict theorist argument. And both the structural functionalist and the conflict theorist argument look at the power structure, they look at racism within the institutions, and research, continuous research goes to show that there is a problem going on within our institutions. So that is all for today's pre-recorded lecture. Make sure that you take the lecture quiz after watching this. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can find all my contact information on our Blackboard class page. Have a good day.